Welcome to today's schedule or panel discussion on soil management. This is part of the Central Dakota Ag Day program. I'm Jeff Gale, NDSU Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources in Foster County, and my co-moderator today is Lindsay Maddock. Lindsay, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm Lindsay Maddock. I'm the Extension Agent in Wells County in Fessenden. So I'll keep an eye on the chat box as we go through this session here and make sure that all of your questions get vocalized so we can get them answered.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Just a moment, we'll give you an outline for the program today. If you were in the previous session, it will be similar. We have a 50-minute panel discussion scheduled. We'll begin by letting the speakers introduce themselves and give a 1 or 2-minute summary about their presentations that were in the area of soil management. The main purpose of today's meeting is to give you an opportunity to ask some of your questions. We'd prefer if you could type those questions into the chat box. If you feel you have a long and complicated question and that doesn't work very well, you could unmute yourself or make some other signal and we'll help you get unmuted, and you could submit your question that way. Today's session is worth continuing education credits for certified crop advisors. And at the end of the session, we'll show a QR code that can be scanned to receive that credit. And at the end of the program today, we'll also post a link for at the program evaluation in the chat box. So we'd appreciate it if you'd give us some feedback about this year's programs. That will help us to plan for next year's event. Okay, we have 5 presenters today: Greg Andres, Mike Osley, myself, Jasper Thibault, and Lee Breeze. So I'd like to just begin by letting them introduce themselves and give you a short summary of the content of their presentation. So Greg, do you want to start?
Yes, I sure can. I'm Greg Andres. I work as an extension agronomist. I'll kid a little bit and say that I've been around for a long time. Even long enough where I can remember Lee Breeze without a beard. So in my video, I talked about 3 cover crop trials that we're conducting at the center with soybean and dry bean. And 2 are in soybean. The first one is where we're looking at winter rye planted in the fall at 2 dates and then 3 planting rates. And very simply, we're looking at the sweet spot for people to determine what's the best stand to achieve whatever their cover crop goals are. And so we've conducted the trial for 2 years, and we found, as you'd probably suspect, that planting earlier in the fall with higher rates have provided better ground cover as well as increasing weed suppression. And we found that the soybean performs very well amongst all of the treatments that we've had currently, and perform well in the yield of 45 to 50 bushel. So we know soybean will do well under the system of using rye as a pre-plant cover crop. And then a second trial that we've done with soybean is looking at the tolerance of cover crops planted after a soybean production system where we've used herbicides that have soil residual. And very simply, we rated 8 cover crops amongst 9 herbicides. And we'll be publishing a table in the 2021 Weed Control Guide, and that'll be available probably in about a month. And that'll be a simple table that you can refer to determine what cover crops to grow based on tolerance or not. And then finally, a trial that we've conducted 4 years with dry bean. We've looked at how well dry bean will perform with rye as a pre-plant cover crop. And our data so far indicates yields are very good. All 4 years of the trial, we've had dry weather during establishment of the dry bean, and thus we needed to terminate the rye at least 2 to 3 weeks before the dry beans are planted in order to preserve the dry bean yield. And we did see some very positive things with allowing the rye to grow longer up to dry bean planting time, to the point where the yield, or excuse me, the weed control with the rye was very similar to using a pre-emergence herbicide.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Mike, could you introduce yourself and a brief summary of your presentation?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So I'm Mike Osley, the research agronomist here at the Carrington Research Extension Center. My presentation has to do with the 60-inch corn management strategy, and this was kind of the first time we've had some nice replicated research to look at regarding that strategy in North Dakota. And last winter there was an awful lot of energy and enthusiasm among producers, not only here but in the surrounding region, to kind of tackle this on their farm. And so there's really an awful lot of on-farm demonstration that went along with this too this year. But the concept is that we'd be planting corn in wider rows than probably anybody is accustomed to, with the goal of maximizing the amount of light capture. And so you're going to likely in this area be planting a cover crop between those wide corn rows for either grazing purposes or other soil health reasons. And in an ideal situation, you'd be trying to approach the yield of a standard row spacing. In my presentation, I break down the numbers quite a lot on kind of what we're seeing, but just to summarize, I think people kind of need to temper their expectations a little bit. By increasing that row spacing, it's going to be very difficult to match what you're going to be able to get on a narrow row spacing. And so I think some yield loss should be planned for. We've saw anywhere this year from 5 to up to 20% yield loss from what between the research and on-farm trials is what I've been hearing. So that's potentially pretty substantial. And our research at this point is to kind of figure out, moving forward, how can we bridge that gap to make the yield differences a little bit less.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Jasper?
Yeah, this is Jasper Tibble. I'm a research soil scientist at the Carrington Research Extension Center. Our presentation is based on the impact of nitrogen stabilizers on yield response of corn and on wheat. The importance of the study is based on the fact that over 100 nitrogen stabilizers, enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizers are sold or commercialized to farmers every year. It's one of the fastest growing industries in Europe. And because of that, a lot of products have been sold to farmers which do not meet the standard of nitrogen stabilizers. So companies contact us to test products that they are producing. And one of these companies was Renovix. Renovix is a Fargo-based industry that formulates nitrogen stabilizers. And this was the very first field test that was conducted with this product. So it's a polymer coated fertilizer, which is to prevent or minimize the release of nitrogen from the fertilizer when it is applied in the soil and incorporated in the soil. Now, this is different from the urease inhibitors, which are applied on the surface, to prevent urea from being hydrolyzed and converted to ammonia and loss. The other company that contacted us was AquaYield. They produce a fertilizer called Enhance. This is a liquid fertilizer. So it's a material that they apply to UAN 28. And when applied in the soil, it provides a physical barrier preventing nitrogen from release quickly. Last year, we did this study. We did not see an impact of Enhance. But this year, when we applied the material on the surface, so what we did was we applied Enhance on soil surface and did not plant anything. We applied it, so we applied 150 pounds of nitrogen as Enhance, 150 pounds of nitrogen as UAN, and then we applied a treatment that we did not apply nitrogen. We took soil samples subsequently, and then we found that Enhance successfully minimized nitrogen loss by maintaining the highest amount of nitrates in the soil during the subsequent sampling period. We also tested Anvol as a urease inhibitor. Now, the same company that produces Anvol also produces Agrotane as well as Super U and different variants of Super U. Now, these Super U Agrotane, they have been proven to be efficient at minimizing nitrogen loss either on the surface or in the soil.
Okay, Jasper?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we just like to keep going with the introductions, and we can come back with your questions, okay?
Okay, thanks.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
That's right.
Okay, Lee?
Yeah, thanks. So my talk was about water, too much and not enough. Seems to be a common problem pretty much every year in North Dakota. I always joke that we have a flood early and a drought late. Kind of the point of my talk was really I wanted people to consider using plants as a major management tool. They are a primary water management tool. Yeah, since your crop and your cover crop use water at depth, and those roots help to create aggregates and soil aggregates that help actually increase your water infiltration. It helps you manage water that way as well. And they should be part of a management plan. And that you can use your species, both your cash crop and your cover crops. You can pick species to tailor those to individual fields and situations.
Okay, thank you, Lee. And I'm Jeff Gale. I'm the agent in Foster County. And my presentation was based on a conversation I had with a producer last year. We were driving around the county and he said, you know, we just can't help ourselves. 95% of us plant through those alkali areas, even though know they're likely not going to get a crop. And well, if you do the math, that can end up, if you apply seed and fertilizer to these areas, that can amount to a significant amount of money over the years. So my talk was just to point out that let's stop losing money on these spots. And that doesn't mean turn off the planter, but let's plant some salt-tolerant grasses in the area, try to get these saline sites under control, and maybe even return to production again. So with that now, we'd like to turn it over to the participants and invite you to ask questions to the presenters. Go ahead and type those in the chat box whenever you're ready. And Greg, I'm going to start out with a question for you while we're waiting. Your talk really emphasized the importance of terminating the growth of the cover crop at least 2 weeks before planting dry beans. Is it just as important to do that in soybeans? Is there any reason soybeans would behave any differently than dry beans?
We've done a fair amount of work with soybeans. Mike Osley has led a lot of that work, and he began that back in 2013. But one advantage with soybean is that we are planting them, several weeks earlier than dry bean, and so that means that there may be more soil moisture available, and the rye is at a younger growth stage too, not taking up as much soil moisture as compared to dry bean. So it's just a coincidence that with dry bean, that in the 4 years we've done the work, we've always had a relatively dry spring or dry June when we're trying to establish the dry bean. And I thought for sure this year, with what we went through in 2019 with excessive rain, especially late in the year, all the snow, I thought 2020, definitely we're going to be able to plant our dry beans green, as in planting the dry bean right into living rye, and it'll work out really well. We can enjoy the full benefits of the rye, the weed suppression, maybe even allow the rye to take up even more moisture to get the dry beans established better. But it didn't work that way. We had in this spring, we were dry, especially in June. And so we had difficulty establishing the dry bean that was planted into rye that was not terminated until at the time of planting. And so we had a double hit. We didn't have good rain until late June. And so the dry bean seed just sat there until finally we got the late June rains. And then we had a good stand of dry bean. And then the second hit was, as you can imagine, with the late plant establishment in September when we had the 2 days of killing frost. So then we got hit on the backside. We had a lot of immature dry bean seed out there that didn't make quality. So over the 4 years, we saw about a 25% yield loss by waiting to terminate the rye at planting time or a week or so later versus pre-plant termination at least 2 weeks or more before the dry beans are planted.
Okay, thank you.
We did have Sarah jumped into the chat with a quick question asking if anyone has any recommendations for a cover crop to plant after soybeans. She said she was, I gotta scroll up here, hoping to find a broadleaf crop that would be a winter annual and start growing in the spring, but be easy to terminate prior to planting spring wheat. They've had some trouble terminating rye prior to wheat in early April, and she'd like to have something out there to prevent and reduce erosion. So if any of our panelists want to touch on that question, that'd be great.
The only one that I've seen has been winter camelina. Yeah, and establishment's been really difficult. And if it's not established really well, it doesn't overwinter very well. And then it's going to have some issues with our herbicide residuals. So I don't know that we found one yet.
Mike, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just echo what Lee's saying. I mean, I think camelina holds some promise, but it's, rye is a nice one to start out with, in a lot of cover cropping systems because it's really flexible and it does well, it grows well, it overwinters well. I think people get kind of spoiled with that because most of the other options out there are not going to be so nice to work with. And, maybe someday with some of the crop improvement that's going on in camelina, there might be some better options. But yeah, right now it's there. It's going to be a little more finicky, and people are welcome to try it.
All right, another question we had in the chat from Austin regarding salinity. With Austin's organization, they have cost share to help pay for conservation practices on saline acres. What is the most effective vegetative treatment to reduce effects of salinity? He says, I know permanent vegetation is likely the answer, but in certain situations like CRP, not much management is allowed. Would it be better in slightly saline soils to use a managed perennial like alfalfa or an aggressive cover crop? Or is permanent vegetation still the best?
Okay, thanks, Austin, for your question. And you're on my list of people I wanted to email because I wanted to talk to you about the cost share opportunities for working on these saline acres. I think it really starts with soil testing at these sites to determine what salts are present and how much is present. And from there, we can make some decisions whether there are some annual crops that we can use or whether we really need to go to perennial grasses. And I would say that alfalfa is certainly an important component of a lot of these mixes. 'Cause.
Okay, but yeah, if I may add, I think a better option to have a perennial rather than an annual. Because I think that was part of the question. Is it better to have a perennial than an annual?
Yeah. Jasper, can you explain more your thinking?
Yeah, perennial because one, you want to build a good soil organic matter, enhance root development, to enhance drainage. And we know drainage is part of the problem. So if we can maintain roots, deep root and abundant root formation in the soil in order to enhance infiltration, I think that will be helpful. That is one of the reasons why that is important. The second thing is that with perennial vegetation, the crop or grass provides a better cushion for heavy equipment that come around to make turns, So minimizes compaction of the soil. I think those are the two main reasons that perennial vegetation will be a better fit,
Thanks.
And then part of it is depending on the landscape too. We know plants are used to capture, depending on the landscape, to capture the water flow, groundwater flow. That through seepage causes salt accumulation on the surface. So by removing the vegetation, what happens is that you cause a break, in that potential for a permanent crop to intercept that water movement underground, and then which accumulates salts in the during when water moves underground and then accumulates at low spots or so. So the main thing is to have that permanent crop growing to provide the benefits, long-lasting benefits.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have a question from Caitlin to Greg. Greg, did you have any difficulties with the rye as far as killing it off or regrowth?
Caitlin, yes, the first year of the study, we did have some difficulties. We planted a block of rye in the fall, and I wanted to have a conventional system checked. And so I thought, well, leave the rye, and then in the spring, take it out with tillage. And that didn't work very well. It required a couple tillage operations, and I thought later, well, it's good to have the rye cover in the fall, but a couple tillage operations, that removes all the benefits of the rye. And even after 2 tillage operations, we still weren't taking all the rye out. So no tillage to take out rye. And then also when using glyphosate, I discovered that you can go too low on a rate, especially with rye that's pushing growth stages, such as in the late jointing to boot stage. We really need a pound AE of glyphosate. In other words, with Roundup Power Max, at least 28 fluid ounces is appropriate. I've used that rate ever since that first year, and this worked well, even with rye that has started to head. This takes a little longer for the kill, but it works well as long as we have a good spray carrier and have good coverage. And I have not seen regrowth, at least the year of the trial work.
I saw some head noddings and shaking.
Yeah,
So maybe
well,
maybe
yeah,
he's got something to say.
Yeah, I totally agree with Greg. Like you really got to watch it. Rye is tough. Like it gets through the North Dakota winter pretty well. You don't want to go in light-handed. It's not going to work. You want to get your timing right. Yeah, Greg covered it really well.
I'd actually like to add a little bit and say that, I spent a lot of time on rye termination timing with glyphosate, and it's kind of interesting because, sometimes we're going in right at green up in the spring, and we'll go in with that heavy rate, and the rye will just sit there for 1 week, 2 weeks, and not look like it's been touched. But eventually it does die off. So it's kind of funny that when we do these timings where you terminate at green up and then 1 week later and then 1 week later, sometimes the rye is dying at the same rate on like 3 weeks in a row worth of termination. So, just, when the weather is really cold, we just can't expect the glyphosate to work like it is when it's in the middle of June or July. So sometimes when we get those really cold temperatures, you might have to be a little more patient than normal. But we've had really good luck even with those early terminations. I'm not going to say it's a recommended practice. It's certainly going to be a little more risky. But yeah, definitely keep the glyphosate rate up. And glyphosate is going to be the best chemical option you have. I know we've tried some other products, and it just doesn't work quite as well. It's far and away the best choice.
Great.
If I could add, 1 year when I was trying to kill off the rye after the dry beans are up, well, our herbicide options are present, but pretty limited when the rye is, gosh, in the boot stage or even heading. I did use Raptor. That didn't work very well.
No.
And so since then, I've like this past season, I just waited as long as I possibly could before I took out the rye. And this last year was like 10 days after we planted the dry beans. In fact, I even put some boards and pails over a few little plants that are starting to poke out, just so I didn't kill the bean plants, but yet get the rye with glyphosate. So glyphosate clearly is the #1 product for taking out the rye.
Okay. Lee, your presentation emphasized the use of cover crops to manage soil water. Can you share your thoughts about which cover crops are best for different purposes?
So we've been talking a fair amount about winter cereal rye, and that really is like the heavy-handed, high water use, long-term type of thing. You're going to have it in the fall. You're going to have it in the spring. My recommendations for that, Greg's using the 2 weeks timing. I would go off of soil moisture. And when you're out there, you're checking your soil moisture. If you think you're a week away from being able to plant that field, you better be terminating that rye right now. Because it does take, like Mike was talking about, a fair amount of time for that rye to stop, quit growing, that kind of thing. And so that really is the high moisture use. So on, higher clay soils, wetter areas, low ground type of stuff, I would go with that winter cereal rye as the main tool. I think you could use a little bit of winter wheat in that situation as well. It's going to be less aggressive and less growth, and it's going to have a little lower chance of winter survival. If you're into a sandy situation or a light soil situation, then you're really going to want to change tactics a little bit. I'm still going to recommend some grasses, but some spring annual grasses, some things like oats and barley, and even spring wheat can be used well in those situations. What you're trying to do there, in my opinion, is you're trying to get the growth up so that you get residue and actually reduce your evaporation the next spring. So you want that residue to cover and seal that soil up and reduce your evaporation. And then frost kill is going to take care of that for you. And then any winter precipitation you're going to get is going to help fill in and hold that seed moisture. That's really a critical thing for me. Actually, I'm okay with drying out the profile a little deeper, but I need that seed moisture. And I think that's something that Greg was focusing on. And then the third one that a lot of people are using is a brassica species, and typically radish is the main one. Radish is, in my opinion, is somewhere in between, and it's related to rates, how much radish you use. And I'm not a huge fan of high rates of radish. I'm in that 1 to 2, maybe 3 pound camp. With a mixture of other things, radish can grow very aggressively and very deep and get some of that deep moisture for you. And then they're really going to terminate real well for the next spring, and usually not much of an issue. Turnip is similar, but a different animal. I've seen turnip live through the winter. I've seen it be very aggressive and actually very difficult to kill with any herbicides the next spring. And they tend to ball up on the surface of the soil, which is not something I care to see. Those are the easy ones to start with, and you can blend and mix them. This is the other thing. You don't have to go 100% cereal rye, 100% wheat, whatever. I've seen a lot of guys doing, 10, 15 pounds of cereal rye. They want a little bit of carryover, a little bit of green, but they'll do 20, 30 pounds of oats. You want most of it to kill off. So you can blend and mix and match those, and it really comes down to just practice.
Okay. Austin has another question here, and Lee did kind of hint towards it with his last response, but maybe we can get an expansion on this. Has anyone tried using a forage like winter wheat? He asked specifically about Willow Creek in lieu of rye. He says, why overwinters so well, but can be a tough one too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I see if I can get this correct here, but yeah, as far as the winter cereals go, you have your winter rye, winter triticale, and winter wheat. I think some of it kind of depends on availability. All of those are going to, if you're going to be using them in a system, are going to require pretty large bulk quantities, unlike the 1 or 2 pounds of radish or other brassicas. So where you can get your source is going to depend on maybe what some of your choices are. The winter wheat is, if used as more of in a cover crop setting, would be the third option out of the 3 I mentioned. The triticale, I think, could be a good option for a lot of people. It's not nearly quite so tough as the winter rye, but it is nearly as winter hardy. So it does overwinter quite well. It doesn't have quite the same weed suppression that a rye has. So it's kind of a good mixture between the winter wheat and the winter rye. But then again, that comes down to if you know anybody that might have some of that available nearby.
I'm going to ask Mike in regards to your presentation. You mentioned a 14% establishment of cover crops in the 30-inch rows and 40% establishment in the 60-inch rows. And I'm just kind of curious, is that close to what you would hope for or average that would be expected from year to year? What's the variance that you've seen, that type of thing?
I would say, both those numbers are lower than one would hope for. I mean, even on our 30-inch rows where you don't get a lot of sunlight in the middle of the season or end of the season, we've usually had pretty good success with it. A lot of it this year just came down to the timing of the moisture. And I would say on a 60-inch or wide row, it could be 44-inch or whatever people want to use. But on your wide row corn, I would think you can plan for something more along the lines of 80%, if you get a good catch, especially if you're seeding the cover crop. If you're broadcasting the cover crop, it could be all over the place. But if you're seeding a cover crop into a wide row corn, I think you could plan on most of it coming up most years. I actually made a mistake this year in that I planted a field peas actually in between the wide rows right away in the spring, just to kind of get something growing in that gap right away. And that actually wound up lodging over and shading out the surrounding area and really reduced the cover crop establishment. So I'd say even with our dry conditions, we probably would have been approaching that 70 to 80% establishment on our wide rows if I hadn't had that field pea growing in between and causing other problems. So, I don't know what the difference is going to end up being, across years, but certainly you could expect better establishment and much more growth in the wide row corn. But you can still get some pretty good success rates on the narrow standard row spacings as well. And we've seen that in 2019, for instance, we had a really nice cover crop establishment on our 30-inch rows and some other trials. So most of it comes down to seed to soil contact and the amount of water you have in your profile.
And since we got you on, Mike, what are your future research plans related to wide row corn?
Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of people kind of have their expectations have been tempered for the system right now, and probably rightfully so. I think people were maybe a little too high on it last spring, but there's still a lot of enthusiasm out there, and still a lot of people that are interested in making it work. And I guess our goals are to try to help people do that, and I want to get in contact with people a little bit more this winter about some of the things that did or didn't work, what they're happy with, what they weren't happy with. because I think there's still a lot of potential in the system. And I think that through just some different ways of management, we can kind of get the 2 row spacings a little bit more on par. And even if we can't match the yield on a narrow row, maybe if we can work with the inputs a little bit so that economically they're comparable. I guess that's kind of where we're going.
Mike, could I ask a question? Could you mention the weed management implications with wide rows? Like in your trials, do you actually use herbicides, or you just rely on the cover crops, the smother weeds, or live with the weeds that are present? Or what herbicide choices do we have if we use this system?
Yeah, great question. And so with any row spacing, when we're talking about corn cover crops, we're almost always talking about a mid-season planting, so sometime in June or maybe early July. And that's really kind of is an advantage for a corn cover crop system, because that allows us to put down some level of weed control while the corn is emerging, which is very, very critical to corn success. As far as what's available, that's if you're just using something like Roundup, obviously you're going to be able to do almost anything with your cover crop after that. But as we know, with the emerging Roundup resistance problems and the fact that it's non-residual, that can kind of set us up for some hairy situations. But, again, we're planting the cover crops in the middle of the summer. Establishment should usually be pretty quick. I recommend products that might have a short-term residual anyway, to kind of hold the soil weed free through cover crop emergence. We're still trying to get a handle on the best recommendations for that, but we know with some of the grass species and a few of the broadleafs out there, they have very similar herbicide tolerance to as corn. And so we know that there are products out there that can be used with some of the cover crop mixes out there. And certainly the grass species are all going to be very similar in their tolerance to corn, and again, a few of the broadleaves too.
Jasper asks, how long would a farmer typically wait on average to see profits from cover crop use? Has anyone done a study to assess economic returns? Anybody want to take a jab at that?
So I'll take a stab at it. So, I think we need to look at cover crops in a different system rather than direct return on investment in cash dollars. We need to be calculating the value of your erosion loss and what you're preventing with erosion. We need to be looking at things like that. Your supplemental weed control, like when you're using cover crops, like Greg was talking about, they're getting very good weed control with the cereal rye in that system. And that is an entirely different mode of action. It's a non-chemical mode of action. And so that's something that's very valuable when we start talking about things like water hemp or palmer amaranth or some of the other ones that are kochia that are have a lot of resistance things. So you can replace some of those costs. The farmers ask this question all the time, when are the cover crops going to pay? What are they going to pay? I think they pay a little bit all along, and they pay a little bit in little different ways. When you get better soil aggregation, you get better water infiltration, you get better water storage. And if you can save some water into July when we need it, that can make a huge difference. So it's little pieces all the way along, but I don't know that I have seen a handle on calculating that return on investment thing.
I wanted to ask a question to Jasper. Jasper, do I understand the results of what you said when that sometimes these fertilizers, enhanced fertilizers, work and sometimes they don't? Is that kind of your conclusion? And are they ever economically profitable?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Sometimes they don't work. And based on our studies at Carrington, even though Carrington should not be the only example, they hardly work. Now, the reason is it doesn't just depend on the efficacy of the product. It depends a lot on climatic factors, you know, and the conditions under which farmers should use these products are not necessarily typically experienced by farmers, okay? When the soils are wet, most farmers don't apply fertilizer under that situation, say urea on the surface, okay? Now, we are conducting studies close to typical situations where nitrogen would be lost, yet we don't see a big enough response to cover for the expense, for the cost of that. Nevertheless, because we are doing soil fertility trials, and because we have to apply our urea on soils that are probably no-till in some cases, we have to apply on the surface. And the best way for us to ensure that our crop responds to the nitrogen treatment is by protecting it with agrotene or any of the products. So yes, they don't work as often as we would like them to work because it doesn't depend on the chemistry alone. It depends on environmental factors. And then secondly, some of the soils that we apply these products on, even though they may reduce nitrogen losses, maybe to some significant effect, if it is in a year where nitrogen mineralization is high, that may there may be enough nitrogen mineralized to the extent that it satisfies the crop needs. So that even if there was an important amount of nitrogen loss, that may be made up by nitrogen mineralization. So these are some of the situations that we have been facing with in our trials. Is it economical? I would say, depending on the farmer's practice in maybe Iowa, in Illinois, where yields are higher than, say, corn yields, for example, are higher than year. And if, let's say, the farmers were on sandy soils where the top dress, that can provide benefits, but the condition should really be such that you have wet soils, really wet soils, very sandy soils, that would recommend a farmer to use this product. I mean, they work, but the environment should be adequate.
Okay, thank you.
We did have another question come into the chat box. Anissa says, Lee, you mentioned putting a value on erosion prevention. How or what resources can you recommend to show the value of that erosion prevention? For example, is there a way to show an estimated dollar value because of the amount of erosion that occurs? She's seen a few things out of Iowa, but wondered if there was any other recommendations.
Yeah, that's a great question and actually really tough to answer. So everybody's enjoying this nice warm weather, and I'm kind of freaking out because we had a lot of fall tillage that happened this year. We have wide open fields. We've had winds, 10, 15, 20 mile an hour winds consistently, and I'm not seeing big dust clouds, but there is a ton of erosion happening right now, folks. And that's really a scary thing. And if you're really curious and you doubt me, I'm going to challenge you to go to Walmart, get a white piece of paper, spray it with that spray-on glue, stick it on one of those fence posts out there, and leave it overnight or a day in the wind. And then you tell me how much dirt's on it the next day. I think you'll be shocked at how much is actually going, even though you're not seeing it. The values I've seen have mostly been in the fertilizer value of these soils. Like people are collecting some of the eroded soil that goes into the ditches and then doing a fertilizer analysis on it. You're finding huge differences. There's a lot of fertility in those the stuff that's leaving your soil. It's just finer particles. That's a big deal. There's a lot of issues with that, but that's only a small part of what your land is worth. We pay big dollars for, you know, good soils that are well drained, that are highly productive, and I don't know that we can quantify that easily.
Another comment we can add that came in from Chris Augustine, he's a soil scientist and the director out at the Dickinson Research Center, says we've seen soil pH and calcium carbonate content increase on eroded soils, and this has increased IDC of soybeans in many fields. So another good comment to add. Thanks, Chris.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Lindsay's going to put the link now for evaluation. Again, you can do it now, or if you're going to stay on for other sessions today, you can do it later today. But we appreciate your feedback today about the Central Dakota Ag Day. Just a reminder, here's the contact information. If you would like to contact any of these presenters with follow-up questions. And oops. For those of you who are looking for continuing education credits, here's the QR code that you can scan, and I'll leave that up here for a few minutes. And finally, just a reminder that today's program involved a lot of people. There were about 11 agents and specialists working together to plan today's program. And we'd again like to thank the Corn Utilization Council, the Soybean Council, the North Central Region of SARE, and Crop Improvement Associations in Eddy, Foster, Griggs, Sheraton, Stutzman, and Wells counties for their sponsorship. So thank you for participating in the Central Dakota Ag Day programs.